Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica White. Like Julie said, I teach printmaking and drawing. I see a few of my students are here. It's nice to see you guys. I also teach occasional book arts and papermaking classes. I have one coming up in the spring called Historical Book Structures. I think at this point it's full. I think there might be one spot left. If you find some interest in this, maybe you can grab that last spot. If not, just keep a lookout for other book arts classes coming up in the future. Right now we have a regular one taught by Whitney Stahl, book forms and papermaking every semester. So look for that. And something I wanted to talk to you guys about is, like Julie said, part of my own interest, and it kind of bleeds into my artwork as well. But it started with this idea of what is a book? So if I say pull out your book, we all think of an object that looks like this, right? Everybody knows this. Even a 2-year-old knows when you say book, this is what we're talking about. There was a time when that was not actually true. These things did not exist. And what we know of as books were really something else altogether. And what I'm talking about this is about written repositories of information, basically. So these are histories that are written into different kinds of structures that are then passed on through the generations. So what I would like to do, first of all, is to share my, hopefully I can share my screen. I have a slideshow that starts with a video. So we're going to start off by watching this video. There it is, Coptic binding from our historic book structures class. And I'm going to get more into details about what Coptic binding exactly means and what it doesn't mean later on. But let's start with this video. I'm going to go ahead and
Broder Ansgar? Ja, der er jeg. Ja, så bra, ok. Ja, hei du. Hei du. Ja. Ja, hva gjelder det? Ja, det er denne her. Ja, vil du sitte? Takk. Ja. Jaha. Ja, så jeg har ikke fått gjort noen ting hele formiddagen. Ja. Nei, jeg beklager at det tar tid. Så skjønner vi holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha hjelp på en gang. Ja. Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller? Nei, den bare ligger der. Okay. Har du forsøkt å åpne den? Ja, åpne den, altså hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helpdesk, hadde jeg vel? Nei, det er ikke. Nei. Vil du ha en kopp av en vann? Nei, det skal være fort gjort. Ja. Se. Du bare gjør der. Sånn. Ja, da er du i gang. Ja, altså så langt kom jeg også. Ok. Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne, så jeg turte ikke å gå videre. Ja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner at inni her, så ligger det kanskje flere 100 sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre, så tar du tak i et ark på den måten her, og så sånn, blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der. Jeg blar, altså? Du blar, ja. Men når jeg skal tilbake, da? Ja, da bare blar du tilbake igjen. Tar tak der, og så sånn. Der, så er du tilbake til den teksten du hadde i stad. Ok, så den slutter der, og så fortsetter den der, ja. Ok, men når jeg skal avslutte for dagen, hva gjør jeg da? Da bare slår du sammen permene. Ja. På den måten der. Sånn. Da er den lukket, der ligger alt lagret inni der. Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå, altså. Nei, alt ligger lagret inni her nå. Da må du i tilfelle sette fyr på hele greia. Det er kanskje lite sannsynlig. Ja, ok. Nei, men for det er noe med det at når du har holdt på med skriftruller, så tar det litt tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja. Ja, flott. Ja, men du, en til før du går. Jeg bare gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner sånn, og så, hva du kalte det? Blar. Jeg blar. Ja, blar videre. Blar frem og tilbake. Ja, teksten ligger der helt. Ja. Og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Oi. Flott. Fint det. Kjempefint. Ja, flott det. Ja, men du, vent. Ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen. Nå får jeg ikke åpnet den. Ja, du har fra feil side. Åpne fra andre siden. Så det er ikke likegyldig det, altså? Åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der. Der er den åpnet. Ja vel. Har du lest manualen, eller? Manualen? Jeg skal følge med som manual og så brukerveiledning. Det er sikkert den der. Der, vet du. Åja, den ja. Står alt sammen. Ja, men ikke sant, der har du samme problemet. Får den ikke opp. Ok, det skulle vi kanskje tenke på.
So this was basically at a certain time period what you would see if you went to the library. Is basically a repository of all scrolls. If you wanted to read a story or get some information, you're opening scrolls and reading through them. And we're talking about really a lot of different places all over the world. This is a rendering of the Library of Alexandria, which is in Egypt. But we're talking about ancient Greece, the Romans, Chinese, and most places in the world where there was written information. And at a time when there were a lot of scrolls, it's basically papyrus that was the main material, and it was all coming out of Egypt. So this is an example of what a papyrus scroll might have looked like. And we do have quite a few still in existence of these Egyptian scrolls that were kept in pretty decent shape that we can still research and study now. And this is one that's about 3,000 years old. Funerary papyrus. So this is a material that was really common throughout basically the Middle East and Western civilization, but over in China, they were using scrolls, same structure, but they were using different materials because they didn't have papyrus growing in abundance where they were, and they did have bamboo. So a lot of the scrolls in China started as these types of bamboo strips that were tied with string across the top and across the bottom. These strips that you see here could also have been made with bone. And this writing that you see is scratched into the bamboo or the bone. And then soot or charcoal was rubbed into it, or sometimes ink, rubbed into it and then wiped off to leave this kind of a dark image, so that made it very easily readable text. And then they'd be rolled up and stacked up in these sort of stacks like this. Later on, the paper was invented. This around 450 AD, and that replaced a lot of those bamboo strips, and also silk. There are a lot of scrolls that were made on silk, but both of those are kind of materials that are more expensive, a little bit harder to come by. And then when paper was invented, it made it a little bit cheaper and readily available, and there was a proliferation of paper scrolls at that point. Paper had not yet been introduced to the West, though, and here I just wanted to show, this is actually not a very ancient scroll, but this is made of parchment. So in the West, we're talking still about papyrus and parchment. You can see where these seams are. I really like this image because you can see these seamed together pieces of parchment, because you can't get a super long roll of parchment because this is the skin of an animal like a calf or a lamb or a sheep. So you have a limited size that you can work with, but you can piece them together in a different way than you would making maybe a paper or a papyrus scroll. And I do want to mention that this is the primary way of sharing information that was also religious. So a lot of religious texts at the time, like the Hebrew Torah and Buddhist texts, were all basically written in this format and shared in the scroll format. So what are we talking about? Basically, a scroll is a roll that's constructed of material that ranges from papyrus to parchment, and that includes, of course, paper and bamboo as well. However, the material is taken from the papyrus plant. It predominantly composed the scrolls of the ancient world, and that's partly because it was so accessible at the time, because since 3000 BC, the plant was native to Egypt, and they were considered the major distributor to the rest of the Mediterranean world. They basically had like a dominance of international exporting of papyrus, and they made sure that everybody had plenty of papyrus, and it was a huge part of their economy back then to sell papyrus to all parts of the world so that they could create their scrolls and record their information. So you can see a little bit here. This is what the papyrus plant looks like. And what I'm talking about is the use of the stalk right here, not these frilly parts at the top, but the long stalk was cut into strips. And I use this image because you can kind of see some of the strips that are in this area. They're lined up vertically and horizontally, and then pounded together so that the fibers kind of mesh together and create like this nice strong substance that can be then rolled up and written on and stored, and last for a pretty long time. And then over in China, we were working again on a different substance, on paper. So this is something kind of interesting because a lot of people think of the Gutenberg Bible as the first printed text, but I just wanted to point out that Wang Jie and the Diamond Sutra was actually the first printed book in existence that we know of. Excuse me, hold on a minute. Okay, you need to go downstairs. I'm going to finish this presentation. Okay, so what were we talking about? Let's see, on this day in I'm going to move this real quick, 868 AD, or the 13th of the fourth moon of the 9th year of Shangtong in Jed's time. That's based on the Chinese lunar calendar. He commissioned a block printer to create a 17.5-foot long scroll of secret Buddhist text. That's what's called the Diamond Sutra. It's actually a much longer name, and they've shortened it to just the Diamond Sutra. And the reason that we know who did it and when it was done is because of this inscription that's very helpful that says it was reverently made for universal free distribution on behalf of, by Wang Xia on behalf of his two parents. So this scroll, one of the scrolls is housed at the British Library, and this is how we know it as the oldest dated printed book in existence. And there are fragments of it, many more in existence as well. So I just wanted to show an example of what that might have looked like. A wooden block that's carved here would have been covered with ink and then pressed onto a sheet of paper, enough to create 17.5 feet long of information. And this was a way for them at the time to distribute these Buddhist texts around the entire country. And for this reason, the literacy rate in China was actually quite high at that time because they were expected to be able to understand and read this information. All right. So then we go into Coptic history. We're going into the Coptic binding. And what we're talking about is a history of Egypt that begins with the introduction of Christianity in the 1st century. So we're talking about Christianity that is created or developed right here in the Middle East. 1st century, we're talking about within the first 100 years after Christ's death. So this is still a very, very new religion, new philosophy, and the stories are entirely new. And Egypt, we're talking about this part of Africa. And here we have the mouth of the Nile. And so these people, they hadn't traveled quite that far yet down to Egypt. And I just wanted to point out Alexandria is right here, sort of at the mouth of the Nile in Egypt. So here we have early Christians that are spreading the information and the stories around 42 AD. And from Alexandria, Christianity then spreads throughout Egypt through rural areas, mostly along the Nile River, along this area right here. And then the scriptures were translated in the local language, and today is known as the Coptic language, called Egyptian at the time. So this is a very specific sect of Christianity who carried the messages from the Middle East down through Africa and all the way down. In fact, the path they traveled was down here into the Horn of Africa, which is now current day Ethiopia. So the places where we find a lot of remnants of this type of binding, the Coptic binding, is along this path. And because of that, a lot of people know it as an Ethiopian binding. So you might hear about it being called an Ethiopian binding as well. So this is what it looks like. And it is a lot more like the books that we know today. It has that rectangular format, it has a hardcover, has pages that open, it's bound along one side, totally different from the scroll. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about Coptic binding. It is developed by those Christians in Egypt, and they were used as early as 2nd century to the 11th century and even on forward as it spread, as this type of structure spread throughout the Western world. So Coptic bindings are considered the first true codices, which is the plural of codex. So this is what we call a codex basically right now, is this structure book that we know of as a book. It's characterized by one or more sections of parchment, papyrus, or paper sewn through their folds, attached to each other with chain stitch, or also called a link stitch, linkings across the spine. So we also use this term to describe modern bindings sewn in the same style. And when we're talking about sections, we're looking at these. So this book has 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. And what it means is like a stack of paper or papyrus or parchment folded in half. So what we're seeing is the fold here, and the open end is on the other side, and it's sewn along that folded side. Now I want to talk a little bit about codex being indexical reading versus linear reading. So when we look at a book, I'm going to come back to you guys. I'm going to stop sharing so I can come back to the class. And I wanted to show you guys what I mean by indexical reading. If we pull open a book and we look for the index, everybody knows that you go to the end and you find the index and you're looking for something specific. Here I see Book of Hours is on page 129 to 130. Oh, that's really easy. I just go to 129, 130. And suddenly I'm there and I can read exactly what I'm looking for. This is what's called indexical reading, by using the index as a source. And some of you may be familiar with the practice in a Christian service. A lot of times the pastor might call everyone in the service to pull out their Bibles and open it up to a certain chapter and a certain verse. And people do the same thing. They flip it open and then they find it. And now they're all reading the exact same passage. They're studying the same thing at the same time. And they're picking and choosing what they want to read and study at that time. Now, imagine if everybody in that service had their scrolls and they had to start scrolling through and try to find that same spot. It would be a big mess. Everything would be flying everywhere. I mean, the scrolls would be rolling down the floor, and it's just not a good way of studying this type of text. So this is one of the reasons why those Christians created a different structure, because they had readings that were meant to be read in a different way, in the indexical way, as opposed to linear, which is from beginning to end, which is how a scroll is supposed to be read. So this changes a lot of things, not just the structure, but the way that it's read, the way that it's studied, the way the stories are spread. And one of the reasons they wanted to do this also was to differentiate themselves from a lot of the religious texts that were out there already. We're not Buddhism, we're not Judaism, we're something totally different and suddenly totally new. And they're trying to sort of get the word out that this is something new and different, and this is another way of doing it. So now I'm going to come back to sharing my screen again. And we have here, all right, so this is the Codex. Let's go to the next page. So here, of the original Coptic bindings, we have about 120 original and complete, so like a whole Coptic binding during that time that survive, although we do have about 500 remnants and parts and pieces. A lot of these are found, like I said, along that path from Egypt into Ethiopia. A lot of them are buried in sand. They're found in these caves. And the nice thing about that climate is that it is dry and arid, and it actually preserves a lot of these books really well. That's one of the reasons we're able to find them. And I want to mention that the materials that we've seen in some of the traditional production, of course, there's a lot of papyrus. So papyrus seems to be the preferred writing material. And then paper and parchment are also found in some of these Coptic bindings. So at this time, some of the paper is being introduced, and parchment, of course, is another material, but it's a little bit more expensive and harder to come by. In this picture, I wanted to show you something that's really interesting, is that because they were carrying these books through the desert, they were nomads. We have the book here, but in order to protect it, they were carried in these kinds of pouches where there's like a two-part pouch. So if the book would be put in this pouch, and then it would be inserted into a second one. So it's completely sealed and protected from the elements. And then we have this loop where they would like loop around their neck so they could carry it with them through these travels and safely protect the books. So virtually all the boards of late Coptic codices are made of papyrus. I'm going to show you an image of that in a little while. But what it means is basically a number of sheets of papyrus are pasted together and pressed into a solid substance called cartonnage, basically making like a board out of papyrus. And then later on in the 4th century, wooden boards were also frequent. And then by the 4th century and later on, most of these books were covered with leather and then decorated. So here's an example of a leather-bound book with decorations, and you can kind of see those indentations in there. What they would do is take a piece of metal that's been carved or cut or hammered into a specific design, heat it up, and then press it into the leather to leave those kinds of indentations. And the heat would actually make these black marks too. And here's an example of what a codex made from parchment might look like. So these are made from skins. Looks like it's been through some wear and tear, maybe a fire. So these are some historic models made by my friend Islam Ali, who does such a great job showing how these are made from the inside out. So here you can see the example of what I was talking about, papyrus cartonnage. If you take layers and layers and layers of parchment, glue them together, you can create a really hard, stiff board that makes a great cover for a book. And here you can see where it's sewn along the folded edge. There's something called an end band that helps protect the tops and the bottoms. You can see the top of it here on this side. And then it would then be covered with like a piece of linen to help give it support, and then covered entirely with leather. And here you can see a few of the pages of the papyrus inside. And then this is a later model of an Ethiopian binding where the boards are wooden and then covered with leather. And again, with that tooling of the leather showing the decoration on the covers. He even decorated the tops and the bottoms of these books, which is really beautiful. But the essential structure is what we call the Coptic binding. A lot of people do consider this Coptic, and it's become sort of a ubiquitous kind of book binding structure now for a lot of handbook binders. So if you take a workshop, if you take a class, you will almost always learn how to do the basic Coptic. And in some ways, I mean, if you want to be a real purist about it, this is not necessarily a Coptic. It is a link stitch binding with wood covers, but to be fully Coptic, it would need to be covered in leather and have these end bands. So a lot of times when I teach it, I call it a link stitch. And you can see this close up of the stitches, and it looks like a braid, and that's why it's called a link stitch binding. And it can go in a lot of different directions too. So this is an example. Here's a drawing of what each stitch actually looks like, creating these links that kind of connect all these sections together. And it's a little bit hard to see in this. This is a model that I usually pull out during class, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different styles of link stitches. And these are also historically researched. Basically, as they found these different books, they noticed that the stitch itself was similar with slight differences. And it basically just depended on who was doing the binding and what they like to do, what their preferred method was. So we have talked a lot about these historic models, but I wanted to tell you that there are a lot of ways that you can take it into book arts, like contemporary book arts. There's so many people out there right now using this stitch as a sketchbook, as artist books, as all different ways that you could really explore book artistry. And I just have a few examples here by one artist, Dan Essek, who actually lives here in Asheville. And he's kind of a world-renowned book artist. And this is some of his earlier works. And I love how he used this link stitch as a way of sort of connecting the past with the present. So he basically does a very traditional Coptic link stitch with the end bands, with the wooden boards, but then he attached tintypes. He does this with a lot of his books, attaching these tintypes. And I wanted to show this because this is a really great example of how a medieval library might have looked, where they had these shelves and books were literally chained to the wall so that nobody could walk away with a book, because they are really valuable objects back then. They were very rare and hard to make, and so they didn't want anybody wandering off with their books. And you could see sometimes these images of like rows and rows of books chained to the wall, recreated by artists that are recreating that image. So Dan, along with a lot of other artists, have played around with this idea of the caterpillar Coptic, where you take this Coptic and add a cord inside and stretch it across the binding so it looks like there's caterpillars crawling around on the binding. And by the way, these are windows that he creates covered with mica, and he calls them like reliquary books, where he puts special objects inside these boxes, inside these books, and then covers them with mica. Oh, and these are his reliquary objects. So he's kind of gone into a very sculptural mode with a lot of his books, where he'll create these really miniature, tiny little Coptic bindings and then house them into these specially made containers. And he's really played around with the idea of what a book can be and what it can do. And here is the binding. You can't even see it. The Coptic binding is back here. That's the spine. So this book is displayed always open, and you're really looking at the interior of the front and back cover, while the covers are being propped up with all of these nails that he nails into them. another object. And here we have books inside as well as being held in the beak of this bird. And he's recently gone almost fully sculptural with a lot of his book objects, where he has these sculptural objects that are holding. He likes having a book in a beak, or this is the mouth of an animal. And I'm going to show you a close-up of that. These are actually really hard to make. The smaller you go with it, the harder it is to make. So this is a really tiny little Coptic binding that he's put into this mouth. And I feel like he is in that place where he's sort of floating between the art world and the craft world, between the place of sculpture versus book art. And he's kind of like in between and in all of those places all at once. And what I'm going to do now is stop sharing and give you guys a chance to ask any questions about anything you saw in that slideshow.
Can you say the name of the artist again who you were just showing?
Yes, it is Dan Essig, written in the chat. That's correct.
Okay, just want to make sure I got it right.
Yeah, he has a studio. I think he still has a studio at Grovewood Galleries. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he also has a private studio and a workshop here in Asheville.
Can you use pleather instead of leather or like a cloth?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, I use bookboard and cloth, which is sort of a modern material. So we take what we learned from the past and, you know, adapt it to what we have. Pleather can work in some cases. So the problem with pleather is it's not quite as structurally sturdy as leather. So there's a tendency sometimes for it to tear a little bit. So you have to be a little more careful with it, but it's possible.
Yeah.
Jessica, there's another question in the chat.
Oh.
I can read it if you want. It says, I love the caterpillar spine so much. Do we ever see spines covered with other animals or just caterpillars?
It's really just called caterpillars because they look like it. So if you are, you know, experimental enough to maybe create different animals, you might be able to make one that looks a little like a lizard, or I'm not sure what else, but it has that sort of like a long, stretchy kind of fat quality. So it just looks like a caterpillar, but with sewing, and especially for those of you who are familiar with embroidery, you could really be incorporated into a lot of different designs in that way.
I was wondering how the mica windows are made, because it tends to be kind of fragile, right?
Yeah, it does. So you have to be very careful with it, but you can get mica in fairly large sheets. I mean, Dan gave me a sheet that was like this big. I don't even know what to do with it. So it's pretty amazing how all the different varieties of mica you can get. Some are a little bit stronger, but like if you're like walking around, this is one of the beauties of living in this area. We have some of the biggest mica deposits in the world here. And I think that's where he was first drawn to it when he moved to Asheville. But yeah, if you go out into your yard or driveway or something, you pick up little pieces of mica, they seem to flake really easily, right? But you can actually buy mica that is stronger and in larger sheets. And you just have to be very careful about peeling them apart. And like you've mentioned, when you, if you just stick a nail into it and start hammering it away, it could break into little pieces really easily. So what he usually does is he takes tiny drills and pre-drills holes in them first, and then hammers them into place. And that helps them not to break so easily. But you do have to be really delicate with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was a little interested in that kind of discussion of the distinction between art and craft with those books, and like his sort of style, and kind of more broadly like books. I think that's like a really interesting topic. If you had anything else to say about that.
Oh man, I could talk all day about that. Yeah, so I feel like there are places where, especially book art, really like you're saying, it straddles, because there's a craft of creating the book structure itself, and it's pulled from historic models And it really has a lot to do with materials and the tools that you're working with. And it takes a lot of time to really perfect that kind of craft of the building of it. But the beauty of books is basically as a repository of art in a way. Not only the structure itself, which you saw Dan do, but you could also create book art where the interior content is photographs or paintings or prints. And that's where it becomes sort of like that connector in a way of becoming partly in the craft world and also existing in the art world, because it kind of brings, I feel like it brings a lot of it together.
Yes.
I'm sorry, real
Oh,
quick,
go ahead.
one more thing. And for that reason, this is a little bit a weird place for book artists to float Pete as well, because I have books that end up showing in galleries, in art galleries and art shows, but the main people or the main collectors of my work are actually libraries. So if you want to see my personal books, you go to a library to look at it. Or if I'm having a show, you can go to a gallery and look at it. So it's like the same book in two different places. But there are some libraries out there, and I know the Duke University and at Chapel Hill, the libraries there have really extensive artist book collections where you can see more of these artist books.
Jessica, when you were talking about the shift from the scroll to the book, is there any evidence of something that like as it was developing, was there any kind of intermediate form, or did it just jump from the scroll to the Codex?
There are a few. I think in some cases, there's something in between this multi-section binding that I showed you. That's a single section. And there is a specific book that exists as a model of it, where it looks like somebody took pieces of scrolls and folded them up and put it all into one book instead of multiple. So that is one sort of bridge that crosses there, but there's another book that they have found in this cave in China, the Dunhuang collection. It's called the, what is it called? I think it's called the Whirlwind book, which I think is really interesting because it is it's a book with many pages, and the top page is kind of short, then the next page is longer, and the next page is longer, and the next page is longer, and the next page is longer. So it kind of like folds out like that, but it becomes very long in a way that then is rolled up into a scroll. So that to me is the perfect kind of in-between point. Now that's specifically to China though, and I don't know of anything equivalent to that over in the West.
That's cool. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, I see another one in the chat.
Oh, can you read it to me?
Yeah. Hang on. I really dig the idea of the reliquary in a book. Do you know if there's any historical precedent for that, or is it solely a modern thing, like that the artist invented?
Well, some of the historic precedents that I can think of, they don't necessarily have these boxes in the book like Dan created, but a lot of medieval books are holders of important objects in a way that they're embedded into the binding. There are some very jeweled bindings, and there are bindings with very specific hand-worked metal plates. So if you look up some of these medieval bindings, they can get really, really elaborate, and they are just like, they're like jewels in themselves just because they are so fully decorated. So they become almost reliquaries by what's embedded onto the covers, but not necessarily in a box. I would have to ask Dan if there's some sort of historic precedence for this creation of a box. I haven't actually seen any. I think that might be his thing.
You know, I mean, I can think of some. We didn't really cover so much medieval art in this class this time, but I wonder if sometimes on the covers, because sometimes the covers are metal, and they do have gemstones in them, and they might have like a little piece of bone or some kind of relic. But Dan's book also reminded me of like a Ninkinzi figure, which is a West or Central African. It's like you know, it's a sculpted figure, and then they have a little box in their belly that has relics or other things. So it's almost like it's drawing on that tradition too, which is an African tradition of making these kind of, they're like power figures.
Yeah, that would totally make sense. And I wonder now if there are maybe some Ethiopian books that maybe brought those two together. I don't know of any, but it seems like because these are both prevalent in African book and artwork, that maybe somebody along the way would have brought it together.
Yeah. I'm trying to find the name of that, the Ninkinzi figure. Hang on. Yeah, it's NKISI, if people want to just look up what they look like. That's great. Does anybody have any other questions? The other thing it just reminded me too, made me start thinking about the Bayeux tapestry, you know, the French, where it's a embroidered tapestry, but it's like a scroll too. And I can't imagine that's not the only one, that there are others.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is another place where things kind of get blurred of what is what. Is it a tapestry or is it a scroll? Is it both? And you're right, that is just another material that was used. And I think in some ways it depends on how it was intended to be displayed. So if it's hung up on a wall, then it's maybe something different than a scroll that's curled up in a roll and set on a desk somewhere. But it kind of changes too, depending on the time period. You know, like what was the intention of the people who made it at the time period they made it, and then how are things displayed today? A lot of Chinese scrolls are displayed completely spread open in the galleries and in the libraries now. It doesn't make them less of a scroll, but we display them in that way. So this is kind of one of my frustrations. My grad school thesis, I made a 25-foot long scroll, and it's shown in the library, it's stored in a box, and people pull it out and they need a big table and they're trying to scroll through it. And it's really frustrating just to even watch somebody, because we have gone from, like that first medieval video that I showed about people having trouble with the Codex. People now have trouble looking at scrolls because we don't really know how to handle them. It's something that has to be learned, and we've lost that knowledge because we're used to handling books instead, which is second nature to us. And so because of watching people have that frustration, I took my 25-foot long scroll, I managed to find a gallery with a wall big enough, and I put it up on the wall. And that was how it was viewed. But the interesting thing is, because it's so long, you have to walk along the scroll to see all of it. So there's like a whole nother way of reading scrolls that are either on the table that you have to maneuver, or up on a wall that you have to walk through. You become a different kind of participant in that object in that way. Oh, before we go, I just want to mention that there are a lot of scholars now who are writing about the revival of the scroll, because in some ways we now scroll more than we turn through pages. As we stare at the computer screen and on our phone, we're scrolling all the time. So the scroll is actually coming back in another way. And again, it's like this interesting place where this is the kind of exciting part about scrolling on a screen. We are finding a way to combine linear reading with indexical reading. All of those links and hashtags is indexical reading, and it's all put in along a long scroll. So here we are in digital age, putting it all together.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how just, yeah, that we pulled out that word scroll, that, you know, out from the past. That's great. Well, thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions for Jessica?